As to taxing themselves, how can so many colonies fix the proportion which they shall pay themselves? Supposing each county was to do this in England, supposing we were to assess the sum and let them tax themselves, what danger arises from this? While they remain dependent, they must be subject to our legislature. They have increased under former taxes, and they will flourish under this. They have in many instances encroached and claimed powers and privileges inconsistent with their situation as colonies. If they are not subject to this burden of tax, they are not entitled to the privilege of Englishmen. Hello, history friends, and welcome back to my channel. My name is Lisa. I am an American historian, and here on Historical USA, we discuss the people, places, and events that have made America. Now, in this episode, we will talk about the early opposition to the stamp tax and the rise of the trumpet of the American Revolution, Patrick Henry himself, and his Virginia resolves. In February of 1765, Prime Minister George Grenville met with a small group of American colonial representatives in London. Chief among those representatives was Benjamin Franklin. For years, Grenville had contemplated a colonial stamp tax, a pretty common form of British taxation dating back to 1694. Legal documents, academic degrees, appointments of offices, newspapers, playing cards, and dice carried an embossed treasury stamp to prove payment. Well, British officials had really considered a colonial tax several times throughout the colony's history. They never usurped colonial responsibility for internal taxes. Now, in this small meeting with colonial agents, Grenville explained that the cost of the 7 Years' War, and more importantly, the cost of the North American French and Indian War, made it necessary for Parliament to levy the colonies to recuperate the cost of defending them. With the colonial backlash that Grenville's Sugar Act and Currency Act, Grenville took the time to consult with colonial representatives and asked what was the best way to levy taxes against the colonists. Well, all of the colonial agents disagreed with Grenville's proposal of this stamp tax on the American colonies. Franklin went further and explained to Grenville that if he was going to tax the Americans, this should be done in the usual constitutional way. This meant that it would be up to the king to request the various colonial legislatures to implement a proposed tax, and that it was the colonial legislatures alone who really had the power to tax their inhabitants. Now, Grenville then asked further, would Franklin and these other colonial representatives commit that the colonies would even agree to the proper amount needed and how to appropriate a tax among themselves in order to pay for this debt. Now, when Franklin nor the other colonists could commit themselves to an answer, Benjamin Franklin went away and pondered on a solution that would fairly pay the debts America owed to Britain. A few days later, Franklin would propose his alternative plan to Grenville. As Walter Isaacson writes in his book, Benjamin Franklin, An American Life, it stemmed from Franklin's long-standing desire, both as a rather sophisticated economic theorist and as a printer, to have more paper currency circulating in America. Parliament, he proposed, would authorize new bills of credit that would be issued to borrowers at 6% interest. These paper bills would serve as legal tender and circulate like currency, thus increasing America's money supply. And Britain would collect the interest instead of levying direct internal taxes. Franklin wrote further that it will operate as a general tax on the colonies, and yet not an unpleasing one. The rich who handled most money would in reality pay most of the tax. Grenville was, in Franklin's words, besotted with his stamp scheme, and completely dismissed the idea. I mean, why wouldn't he? It completely defeats the entire purpose of the Currency Act that Grenville enacted only a few months before. Now, in hindsight, this may have been a real fortunate mistake for Franklin, as he later heard from his friends in Philadelphia, who also very much disliked his paper credit idea. Now, Franklin would take a pragmatic approach to the Stamp Act. He didn't really like it, but he reluctantly supported it, even recommending his good friend John Hughes to be appointed the collections officer in Philadelphia. Franklin would write to his friend, quote, "Your undertaking to execute it may make you unpopular for a time, but your acting with coolness and steadiness, and with each circumstance in your power of favor to the people, will by degrees reconcile them." He continued to argue, though mistakenly, in a letter to Hughes, quote, "In the meantime, a firm loyalty to the crown and faithful adherence to the government of this nation will always be the wisest course for you and I to take, whatever may be the madness of the populace." Now, Franklin, in his attempts to remain in good terms with Parliament and the English government, completely underestimated the madness, as he put it, of the populace back home. And while Franklin would receive huge backlash from the people he represented in Pennsylvania, who felt that Franklin did not do enough in opposition to this tax, I mean, the mob would attempt to ransack and burn his newly built Philadelphia home when this crisis reached its fever pitch. It is through this Stamp Act crisis that we will see the rise of strong patriot leaders willing to risk everything in the fight against tyranny and the preservation of liberty. Now, soon after the meeting with colonial agents in London, Grenville brought the debate of a proposed Stamp Act to Parliament. And lucky for us, much of the debate is actually pretty well documented. And though you can find a copy of the extensive debate online, I do want to share with you an excerpt from the debate between MPs Charles Townshend, who argued in favor of the Stamp Act, and Colonel Isaac Barr, who also served in the British Army and had been wounded in Canada during the French and Indian War, and was very much opposed to a Stamp Act in the American colonies. Now, Townshend argued, quote, "And now with these Americans, children planted by our care, nourished up by our indulgence until they are grown to a degree of strength and opulence, and protected by our arms, will they grudge to contribute their mite to relieve us from the heavy weight of the burden which we lie under?" Now, Colonel Isaac Barr countered, but Isaac Barr's response becomes kind of famous and fortuitous to the American colonists. He said, quote, "They planted by your care? No. Your oppression planted them in America. They fled from your tyranny to a then uncultivated and unhospitable country where they exposed themselves to almost all the hardship to which human nature is liable, and among others to the cruelties of savage foe, and most subtle, and I take upon me to say, the most formidable of any people upon the face of God's earth. They nourished by your indulgence. They grew by your neglect of them. As soon as you began to care about them, that care was exercised in sending persons to rule over them in one department and another, who perhaps the deputies of some member of this house, sent to spy out their liberty, to misrepresent their actions, and to prey upon them. Men whose behavior on many occasions has caused the blood of those sons of liberty to recoil within them." See? Pay attention to that. They, protected by your arms? They have nobly taken up arms in your defense, have exerted a valor amidst their constant and laborious industry for the defense of a country whose frontier, while drenched in blood, its interior parts have yielded all its little savings to your emolument. The people, I believe, are as truly loyal as any subjects the king has, but a people jealous of their liberties and who will vindicate them if ever they should be violated by the subject is too delicate, and I will say no more. Now, though there were those in Parliament that opposed the Stamp Act, it would pass the British Parliament on March 22nd, 1765, with the majority of the 205 to 49 votes in the House of Commons and unanimously in the House of Lords, with the approval of King George III. Now, I want to take a minute and break down what the Stamp Act truly was and how devastating and unjust the act was seen by the Americans. And you can read the Stamp Act in its entirety online. I mean, it is a pretty popular primary source that is readily available to you. But the bill was drafted by Thomas Whately, who was the Secretary of the Treasury, and the act applied to many printed documents, including passports, shipping paper, insurance policies, newspapers, playing cards, almanacs, pamphlets, etc. Almost anything that could be printed on. Now, printers were required to buy a specific paper from licensed stamp agents who were appointed by the British government, not the American government. In order for the enforcement of the Stamp Act, the American Stamp Office was established in London with 5 commissioners. The colonies were divided into 9 districts with 23 sub-districts, and a stamp agent would be assigned to each sub-district. Now, all the taxes collected under the act would need to be paid in hard money, that's gold and silver, which was in short supply in the colonies. And if you've watched the last episode where we discuss why there was not any hard money or specie in the colonies, you'll know exactly that it was due directly to Parliament as to why there was such an economic hardship there. So if you haven't checked out that video, you can click the link up here, or you can click the link in the description below. Now, stamp agents would receive a percentage of the funds, which would be very lucrative. And the money would be sent to the deputy paymaster of the British Army in North America. Even though the Stamp Act was passed in March of 1765, it would not take effect until November, giving colonial legislatures time to react and protest the Stamp Act. In fact, the legislatures of numerous colonies, including Massachusetts, New York, New Jersey, Rhode Island, and Connecticut, all sent letters to England protesting the Stamp Act. But it is Virginia who would go one step further. Patrick Henry had gained a following in backwoods Virginia due to his oratory supporting regular people's liberty and his charming demeanor. Now, in 1764, he would increase his popularity by representing Nathaniel West Danbridge, who had been elected for Hanover County to the House of Burgesses. Danbridge, however, was accused of using booze to bribe voters, which was a common but unlawful practice. Henry was reported to have delivered a magnificent speech supporting voter rights, but the text has not survived. Henry would lose that lawsuit, but he met key members of the Committee of Privileges and Elections, including Richard Henry Lee, Peyton Randolph, and George White, all influential members of the House of Burgesses. In 1765, William Johnson resigned as Burgess for Louisa County. As Henry owned land in the county, he was eligible to be a candidate, and he won the seat in May of 1765. He left immediately for Williamsburg, as the session had already begun. Now, Patrick Henry was sworn into what many perceived as a sleepy session of the legislature on May 20th. Many of the members had even already left town. But on May 28th, a ship arrived with an urgent letter. The Stamp Act had passed. On May 29th, Patrick Henry introduced the Virginia Stamp Act resolves. The first resolve stated that all men of Britain in the colony, whether wandering or settling, should be treated as such as they would treat any representative of Britain. They have as much freedom and rights as everybody else in Britain. The second resolve was to remind everybody that all the people in the colony should be treated as if they were born within England's realm. The talk about taxes on the Virginia resolves starts with the third resolve. The third resolve made it clear that no unbearable tax should be imposed to anybody. It states that burdensome taxation would make the colony hard to manage. The fourth resolve states that the Virginians shouldn't be imposed with a tax that was not passed by a body that had not gained their consent. Now, the fifth resolve, and the most controversial, states that the Georgia General Assembly is the only one to have the right to lay taxes on the people in the colony, not Parliament. There are no verbatim transcripts of Henry's speech opposing the Stamp Act. Texts are reconstructions based primarily on recollections from decades later, when both the speech and Henry had become rather famous. Jefferson, for example, Thomas Jefferson, remembered the majesty of Henry's oration while still a student at the adjacent College of William and Mary. And no real attempt was made to reconstruct Henry's comments until a French traveler whose name is unknown and whose diary was recovered in 1921 reported that, quote, during Henry's speech, one of the members stood up and said that he had read that in former times Tarquin and Julius had their Brutus. Charles had his Cromwell, and he did not doubt but some good American would stand up in favor of this country. As Henry had seemingly called for the killing of King George III, there were cries of treason in the chamber, including by Speaker John Robinson. John Tyler Sr., father of the future president, who was standing with Thomas Jefferson as they watched the session, called this one of, quote, the trying moments which is decisive of character, and both recalled that Henry did not waver. Henry cried, if this be treason, make the most of it. The Burgesses voted primarily along geographical lines, with Eastern Virginians rejecting the resolutions and Central Virginians supporting them. Patrick Henry departed Williamsburg, Virginia that night, wary that powerful members of the House would serve him with a warrant. The next day, with Patrick Henry gone, and most of the conservative assembly members back in session, the assembly scheduled another vote on the resolves, with the conservatives attempting to have the resolves deleted from the record. However, Henry's allies were able to save the first four resolutions, the fifth resolution being struck. The Newport Mercury was the first to publish the Virginia resolves to the general public in late June, with numerous other publications following likewise shortly after. Notably, none of the newspapers drew on the official House records. Therefore, they published resolutions including not only the four ratified resolutions, but also the previous withdrawn fifth resolution. The publication of the Virginia resolves sparked a surge in widespread outrage against the Stamp Act, and numerous contemporary sources blamed the resolves for sparking the Stamp Act riots. Governor Thomas Hutchinson of Massachusetts claimed, quote, nothing extravagant appeared in the papers until an account of the Virginia resolves was received, end quote. Later, Edmund Burke attributed the resolves to the beginning of the opposition to the Stamp Act, which contributed to the American Revolution. And we've got more on the Stamp Act. The Virginia resolves is just the beginning of this crisis, and we will have a multi-part episodes on the Stamp Act themselves and the fallout. So don't you wait. If you have not already, please make sure to subscribe to the channel, ring that bell so that you will get notified. Give this video a thumb up. It really helps it out in the algorithm so more people can find history content just like this. Thank you guys so much. I want to shout out to my Patreon supporters. You guys are amazing. I absolutely love you. Thank you so much for supporting my work. We are about to start the August book club. So if you want to join our book club over there, hit up Patreon. It is free to join if you want to just join the book club. There are 2 tiers over there if you want to support my work. Thank you guys so much, and I will see you in the next episode where we start to see the volatility of the fallout from the Virginia results. Thank you guys. Bye.